Scotland is a colony of England and has been from 1707 until today. The narrative of the UK state, which is continually enforced onto us, is that these two sovereign countries with separate crowns and separate territories merged together into a unified territory and a unified crown in 1707. This was a fiction and this was a lie. The flag you see, which was created in 1707, is not true. The country never happened. Scotland's territory never merged with England. It was not a voluntary union. With that in mind, these two organisations, in the summer of 2022, founded the objective of using laws that the UK state has signed up to in order to get the Scottish independence, to get Scotland's freedom back. After lots of years of work, of effort, by many people, they submitted a paper to the United Nations Decolonisation Committee to prove that Scotland is a colony of England on the 7th of March 2025. In that submission, there are several supporting papers. One of them highlights the main events that show that Scotland is indeed a colony of England. These are the colonial markers, the purpose of this talk. This video is the exact text from those markers from those documents with the same headers. The only thing I've omitted is the references to the source documentation. But as you can see in the yellow background statement here, I'll show you how to get those at the end, and also other documents that may be of interest to you. So there's 7 colonial markers, and these were written in a way that people with no knowledge of Scotland's history could understand what was being said. Behind all this, there's lots and lots of detail that will come out in discussions with the UN Decolonisation Committee in due course. But this video, this long video, is the history of occupation. So, Colonial Marker 1, Military Threat, Invasion and Subjugation. 1708, Military Occupation of Scotland. This commenced immediately after the 1707 Union Treaty. English government troops forcibly suppressed anti-Union protests across Scotland and subsequent pro-Jacobite uprisings in 1715 and 1745-46, including the Battle of Culloden near Inverness in April 1746. The 1708 Treason Act. This was introduced to establish a dominion of the English Crown over the Scottish Crown rather than a united Crown. Imposition of English law into Scotland. Imposition of English law in Scotland was a direct violation of the terms of the 1707 Treaty of Union. It enabled violent suppression and deliberate destruction of Scotland's ancient Highland clan society by government forces during the 18th century. Military occupation was enabled by construction of an extensive network of military roads, bridges, army barracks, fortifications and strategic garrison towns across the whole of Scotland to facilitate access and movement by government armies. By 1756, there was an extensive network of new military garrisons established across Scotland. The decades of brutal military occupation of the Scottish Highlands followed the Battle of Culloden, combined with new government laws to outlaw and eradicate the native language, Gaelic, dress, music, religion and customs, effectively destroyed Scotland's ancient system of clans. The brutality of the English occupation from 1746 has largely been written out of Scottish history, along with the records of the overwhelming popular opposition to England's colonialisation of Scotland under the pretext of union. The extent and duration of the 18th century military occupation of Scotland and the severity of the conditions imposed on Scots and the orders issued to troops reflect not partnership but a brutal occupation and subjugation The extent of the military occupation is illustrated on the map on the next slide, which shows the government troop garrisons across the Highlands and Lowlands of Scotland post-1746. This is not a copy of what's in the document that was put to the UN. I couldn't get a decent copy. That document came from the Stennis Historical Society. And this website here, if you go into it, you can go to an interactive map shown here, and you can look at the detail of each occupation. Moving on to Colonial Marker 2, ethnic cleansing, displacement, and settler occupation. For centuries prior to 1746, Scottish clan chiefs held significant judicial and administrative control over their territories and maintained the autonomy of the ancient clan system. Immediately after the Battle of Culloden, the Anglo-British state commenced a programme of forcibly remove indigenous Scots from their land to benefit the colonial elite. This was initially enabled by the 1746 Heritable Jurisdiction Scotland Act, the primary purpose of which was to dismantle the traditional judicial powers held by Scottish clan chiefs and other hereditary Scottish landlords and farmers, and consolidate legal authority in the English Crown and its appointed officials. This centralised legal and landholding systems replaced Scots law and practice with that of England, and enabled the removal of existing landholders and farmers from their farms and holdings. This Act followed English, not Scots law, which vigorously protected landholders' rights. The formal introduction of tenancy as a legal and economic concept in Scotland began post-1746 reforms, particularly through the Heritable Jurisdictions Act and the agricultural improvements. This transition marked the shift from traditional clan-based landholdings to the modern tenancy system familiar today. Using this new act, the administrating powers sought to dismantle the clan system and bring the Highlands under direct legal and economic control. Under the clan societal systems, clan chiefs held land on behalf of the clan, and tenants and subtenants had traditional, often unwritten rights to the land they worked. The relationship was primarily one of kinship and obligation rather than formal contracts. Tenure was customary, and rents were often paid in kind through either livestock or produce rather than cash. Violating the terms of the Treaty of Union, the Heritable Jurisdiction Act abolished the authority of clan chiefs and replaced it with the English traditional tenancy, under which the tenant was entirely at the mercy of the landowner. Thereafter, the comprador class of Scottish elites, trusted and rewarded by the colonising Anglo-British state, was permitted to operate as chiefs and landlords and convert traditional clan obligations into cash rents. This removal of traditional rights allowed the first phase of the clearances to begin, resulting in more than 2 centuries of atrocity, inhuman and ethnic cleansing, much of which has been misrepresented or removed entirely from the record and from popular Scottish national consciousness. 1846 to 1856, famine combined with land clearances. Famine triggered a new wave of mass emigration of impoverished Scots, mainly to North America, Australia and New Zealand, and ongoing rural depopulation of Scotland. As traditional access by the native rural Scots population to their historic land and sea resources became increasingly restricted during the 18th and early 19th century, food scarcities became more common, culminating in the Highland potato famine of 1846-56, in which tens of thousands of rural Scots starved to death. The Scottish potato blight of 1846 to 1856 caused starvation among the rural Highland population. Instead of taking measures to prevent starvation, the British government used the opportunity that was afforded by the vulnerability of the Scottish population to continue to clear. As a result, many thousands became homeless and wretched. The famine offered a win-win situation for the administrative power, who offered destitute landless Scots subsidised passage to the English colonial settlements in Canada, Australia and New Zealand. The cleared land could now be readily populated with more profitable sheep and other livestock. Following the famine, the new landlords, with government support, sought to reduce the population and alleviate economic pressures, often facilitating and financing the relocation. The potato blight and famine of the 1840s also greatly affected Ireland, which was also in an enforced incorporated union with England at the time, and where similar social and land use conditions prevailed. Poor economic conditions in the mid-19th century coincided with the return of the thousands of Scots who had fought for the British Army in the Napoleonic Wars. The elite ruling classes considered that forced emigration could solve the problem of unemployment, and in 1851 the government passed the Emigration Advances Act to assist landlords to finance emigration of their tenants to overseas, as well as the removal of the indigenous Scots peasant population. Prime land was the prize for depopulation. Landlords served inhabitants with notices of eviction, to which there was little right of appeal, and evictions went ahead. No one was saved from forcible eviction during the second half of the 19th century. Forced emigration followed years of famine and hardship. Landlords who had replaced the old clan landholding system resulted in the potato monoculture, blight and famine, were offered financial incentives to insist immigration of the poor from their estates. The administrative power mouthpiece, the Scotsman newspaper, went as far as to condone the removal of the diseased and damaged part of our population. One landlord is quoted as saying that it would be absolute insanity not to take advantage of the present opportunity of getting rid of our surplus population. In the word of Scotland's leading historian Tom Devine, Scotland was the emigration capital of Europe for most of the 19th century. 1920s to 1970s, the Empire Settlement Act 1922. British colonies and dominions, particularly Canada, Australia and New Zealand, to promote the economic well-being of the Empire as a whole. The Act was extended in 1937 and again in 1952, 1957, 1962 and 1967. The British State Resettlement Scheme subsidised transport costs and targeted Scots to move to British overseas colonies during much of the 20th century. Scottish out-migration on a per capita basis was at least 8 times higher than England, so movement was specifically targeted at Scots. While England's population continued to grow throughout the 20th century to in excess of 50 million, Scottish population remained at around 5 million. (1701 to 2024) steady Scots demographic collapse. Scotland's population growth has dramatically failed to keep pace with England over 300 years of union. In 1701, Scotland's population was 21% that of England. In 2025, that proportion has fallen to less than 10%. Scots emigration between 1825 and 1938 was around 2.3 million. For example, 55% of the average population of the period. No European country except Ireland, also colonised by England, suffered this level of population loss. In total, Scotland under the Union has been depopulated to the extent of around 4 million people, 72% of its present population. at least 100,000 in the 18th century, 1.8 million in the 19th century, and 2 million in the 20th century up to 1970. Without immigration, Scotland might have had a population of between 8 and 10 million today. In contrast, England's population has grown consistently and sustainably. An illustration of Scotland's demographic trend by comparison to England, Ireland, and 5 similar-sized European countries is shown in the chart on the next slide. From 21% of England's 5.2 million population in 1701, Scotland's relative population has fallen to 9.6% of England's 55.7 million today. It has remained practically flat since 1951, while England's grew in the same period by nearly 40%. Ireland's population indicated 63% growth in the same period, 75-year time frame, after also suffering as an English colony for centuries. The light grey lines show the population growth of 5 other countries. Comparing the growth over the full 323-year period, Scotland grew by a multiple of 5 compared to England's 11. The average for 5 mainland European states, meanwhile, is 6.5. Despite Scotland's advanced level of industrial development in the 19th and 20th centuries, its population flatlined during the 20th century, in stark contrast with England's spectacular growth, and also with neighbouring European nations who have all exhibited steady growth during this period. Scots immigrants were typically skilled workers, and their constant loss over 3 centuries has suppressed Scotland's national development. You can see here the population growth by countries. The faint grey lines shown here are the other European countries for the same period. Colonial Marker 3: Cultural and Linguistic Imperialism, Cultural Genocide and Cultural Assimilation, 1707 to 2025, Linguistic Imperialism and Linguicide. The Scots are a distinct ethnic group, and Scotland has 2 indigenous languages, Scots and Gaelic, which were both widely spoken in Scotland at the time of the Anglo-Scottish Union. The period since the Union has been a substantial long-term decline in the speakers of Scotland's indigenous languages due to a combination of discrimination, punishment, lack of teaching, and neglect by the Anglo-British state authorities. Linguistic imperialism marginalises and destroys indigenous languages. It results in the death of a language, and with that the removal of significant diminishing of a minority people's sense of national identity. The degrading of Scotland's indigenous languages has been an outcome of the Anglo-Scottish Union. The 2011 Scottish Census recorded that there remained only about 1.6 million people in Scotland who speak Scots, out of a total population of 5.6 million people, less than 30%. Some 70% of the Scottish population are now primarily Anglophone. Although state provision for Scotland's small minority Gaelic-speaking community, around 50,000 people, is provided, the larger Scots-speaking community continue to be ignored. The Scots language is not taught to the Scottish people. The British state has effectively deprived Scots of properly learning their own mother language, preventing them from fully absorbing the main ingredient and basis of their national identity. Loss of language undermines a people's sense of identity and sense of belonging, which is an established aim and feature of colonialism. The result of this is that many Scots today have a confused or dual, also false national identity, British and Scottish, and hence a dual persona. Its ultimate demise is inevitable when it is not taught or given authority, as in the case with the Scots language. In seeking to justify only the English language being taught to Scots in school, British educationalists, even until recently, maintained that Scots was not a valid language. This is ethnic discrimination and abuse of a people's human rights. For example, the rights to one's own language or mother tongue. The Council of Europe, in its minority language reports, has repeatedly criticised the UK and Scottish governments for failing to teach and give authority to the Scots language. Despite this, the indigenous language of Scots remains ignored by British state authorities, including its devolved Scottish administration responsible for education of the people. Because Scotland's native language and culture forms the basis of our national consciousness, within these aspects a people's motivation for nationhood and sovereignty is sorely diminished. Language policy in Scotland, within an Anglophone-dominated social and cultural hierarchy, aims to deprive Scots of their language, to kill it off, and diminish the desire for Scots nationhood and self-determination. The cultural objective of the Anglo-British state towards the Celtic nations, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, has been to make them ever more Anglophone and Anglicised, is part of a long-established imposed colonial language education policy. In this regard, the native bourgeois, including the teaching profession, have generally been the most receptive group towards such a colonial policy, which is necessary for them to maintain their socio-economic status and privileges. Post-colonial theory tells us that native elites and bourgeoisie are eager to cast off their supposedly inferior indigenous native language and culture and to embrace and mimic that of the colonisers, reflecting the fact that colonialism is always a cooperative venture. Motivation for cultural assimilation is also healthily influenced through the promotion of native stereotypes of native, i.e. Scots speakers, supplanted in people's minds via colonial media, broadcasting and education policy. Culture and language are key factors in forming of national identity. 1889 to 2025. Anglicisation of Scotland's higher education. The traditional Scottish approach to education emphasised broad philosophical foundations and first principles, thinking across disciplines, reflecting Enlightenment ideals and close connections to continental European universities, particularly German ones, which in turn emulated aspects of Scots education. Yet, in Empire and even post-Empire Britain, Scottish education has been portrayed as reactionary and constricting. Grimly authoritarian and narrow was the verdict of one of Scotland's most distorting historians, the Kentish import to Scotland's higher education establishment, T.C. Smout. The Scottish philosopher George Davy explored in more serious and sensitive detail the emphasis placed on philosophy and debate from first principles in the native Scots academic tradition before the implantation of teaching more compliant with English culture, which came in full force with the 1889 Commission that led to the University Scotland Act 1889. Of that act, Davy wrote damningly, quote, "The Scottish heritage could much more easily be retained in a fossilised static form, incapable of giving much trouble, than in a developing condition in which it might, from the British point of view, prove embarrassingly alive." Accordingly, the Commission's prime contribution to education was to suggest the introduction of a dual system which ordained the coexistence, side by side in the same institutions, of a Scottish principle which represented the national inheritance, but which was to have little or no future, and of an English principle to which, in spite of its alien character, the future was to belong. The future, Davy says, was to belong to England, observing of Scotland's intelligentsia their abasement into dependency on English cultural modes. Quote, "The only points of view about educational culture which are taken seriously by responsible Scots are those which are reckoned respectable and fashionable over the border." Craig Bevery and Ronald Turnbull are clear about the impulse behind the narrowing of Scots education to suit English imperial demands. Those aspiring to swell the ranks of organisers and specialists required for the new imperial Britain was relieved of the burden of doing compulsory philosophy and, instead, were given a narrower type of training which left them intellectually indistinguishable, or almost so, from the southern product, at any rate provided that, after taking their Scottish degree, they spent a year or two at Oxford or Cambridge, requiring the necessary polish. Scottish philosopher John Anderson, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sydney from 1927 to 1958, and other leading historian of Scottish education, shared Davies' sense of loss of a great Scottish educational tradition under the wheels of the juggernaut of empire, of the highly distinguished system of intellectual values inherited by Scotland from the pre-Union Reformation and the post-Union Enlightenment. Anderson asks, quote, "whether this unique legacy of philosophy-centred system of education was to be vitalised to meet the challenges of the times, or allowed to die out finally and forever." Liberation Scotland is asking the question, will it be vitalised or allowed to die out finally and forever? However aspect of this nation's cultural, linguistic, social and political life, given the very low proportion of Scottish academics at Scotland's universities, see the chart on the next slide, it has today become more urgent than ever. You can see here under the different headings for different subjects at different universities the actual number of Scottish academics in 2020. In other universities in Western Europe, the figure of indigenous professors and principals are around 40 to 45%. Colonial Marker 4, Colonial Administration, 2000 to 2025. England's continued subjugation, dominion and exploitation of Scotland in the 21st century. The continued colonisation of Scotland by England took a more subtle and nuanced form in the 21st century. In 1999, when the Scottish Parliament was set up, England's continued political administrative control of Scotland was ensured by the reserving of all key functions to England's Westminster Parliament by the reserved matters. The effect of the reserved matters is that Scotland is not self-governing or politically autonomous, and that England is able to continue to subjugate, dominate and exploit Scotland. This includes the exploitation of Scotland's land and assets, the alteration of Scotland's territorial boundaries, the sale of national assets and infrastructure to private companies at below market value prices, the adoption of discriminatory pricing and the imposition of unfair taxes, and the adoption of laws and regulations that benefit England at the expense of Scotland. All of these actions and more, taken together, have removed the ability of the Scottish nation to prosper economically. Reserved matters, set out in the Scotland Act 1998, amount to around 70% of the UK government's annual legislative programme. They include all of the key political, economic and fiscal levers of state. These are 1. Constitutional matters, the Crown, Union of Scotland and England, UK Parliament. 2. Foreign affairs, international relations, EU relations, defence, national security. 3. Economic and fiscal matters, monetary policy, currency, financial services, most taxation, national insurance, public service borrowing. 4. Home affairs, immigration, border control, drug policy, data protection, national security, counter-terrorism. 5. Energy, nuclear energy, electricity, coal, oil and gas, energy regulation. 6. Transport, aviation, railways, road traffic laws, marine transport. 7. Employment rights, industrial relations, health and safety. 8. Social security, most welfare benefits, pensions. 9. Broadcasting, BBC, media regulation. 10. Equal opportunities legislation. Colonial Marker 5. Colonial exploitation. 1940s, 50s, 60s. Misuse of Scottish sovereign territory for biological warfare and experimental nuclear testing. During the mid-20th century, the Anglo-British state located experimental biological and nuclear testing programs in remote parts of North and West Scotland. Anthrax. During World War II, the UK Ministry of Defence tested anthrax bombs on the island of Gruniard, located 1 kilometre off the northwest Scottish mainland. Gruniard Island was compulsorily purchased by the UK Ministry of Defence in 1941, and outdoor anthrax experiments conducted with little concern for the safety of the local people. Contamination from this toxic bacterium was recorded a kilometre away on the mainland. Clean-up proved difficult, and the island was finally declared safe only 50 years later. The plague. In 1952, the UK Ministry of Defence conducted peacetime trials of bubonic and pneumonic plague on a ship moored in waters off the Isle of Lewis, the main inhabited island of the Hebrides, for biological warfare trials and with near disastrous consequences. Dunray experiment fast breeder nuclear reactor was built in 1955 by the UK Atomic Energy Authority on Scotland's northern coastline near the town of Thurso. It was the first experimental reactor of its type and bred fissile plutonium for the British government's nuclear weapons programme. Radioactive waste was dumped locally for 18 years, and although the facility is being decommissioned, it is likely that there will be restricted use of this site for several hundred years. The experimental Dunray fast breeder reactor was located in Scotland's northern coastline, since the population was lower than that of alternative suitable areas considered in England. No consultation was conducted in Scotland over the hazardous, controversial and prejudicial use of Scotland's sovereign territory for the production of nuclear energy and weapon-grade materials. Between 1959 and 1977, approximately 800 cubic metres of mixed radioactive waste was dumped in an on-site shaft until an explosion resulted in seawater intrusion and leakage of radioactive materials into the surrounding coastline waters and seabed, resulting in heavy and long-term contamination. A clean-up operation on this shaft is said to be in progress, but it is an extremely complex and lengthy engineering challenge. Dunray itself is being demolished in a decommission project running at £2.6 billion. These examples illustrate the content of Scotland's colonising power towards Scotland's sovereign territory and its popular sense of periphery remote from the metropolitan core, considered suitable for the imposition of dangerous experimentation with little concern for the native population. 1973. Closure of Scotland's stock exchanges and its longer-term consequences for Scotland's economy and industry. This closure moved the Scottish Stock Exchange, the centre of investment business in Scotland, out of Scotland and into England, mainly London, thus hampering attempts by Scottish technologies and leading many to seek investment from offshore entities that both assumed ownership and extracted profit from Scotland's economy. The act of removing a fundamental instrument of trade, Scotland's Stock Exchange, was executed at a time of growing Scottish economic expansion, as the development of Scotland's vast North Sea oil and gas reserves was just commencing. Financial control was deliberately moved south to benefit England, with professional services following suit, an act of manifest harm to the Scottish economy. Scottish ownership and control of any significant aspect of the oil and gas industry was thus thwarted. This colonisation appropriation of the assets of Scotland has continued through current externally funded activity in renewables generation and energy storage development, particularly under the tax incentives of the free ports and special economic zones in Scotland, schemes of deepening external economic control imposed on Scotland by the UK government. This comment from the Energy Voice describes the impact. Quote, "This lack of financial support, combined with politically driven ideological indifference, meant that we never really became a supplier of sector-critical hardware, and when we did, the companies concerned generally found itself turning to overseas sources of finance, or simply selling themselves to an overseas company or private equity outfit to be able to fund their next stage of development. It's surprising how many companies we think of as being local are in fact overseas owned by virtue of a corporate or private equity buyout." The article continues, "A study by Momentous Change Limited last year into the viability and potential for a new Scottish stock exchange noted that the last Scottish exchange closed in 1973 and was merged into the London Stock Exchange. Had it survived, it would have enabled Scottish companies to raise capital, buy productive assets and grow in Scotland, helped ensure liquidity and of course to help in the overall scaling up progress. Norway, Denmark and other small countries have stock exchanges for these very reasons, and it's not a coincidence they're already outperforming Scotland in developing energy transition technologies." 1999. Transfer of 15,500 square kilometres of Scotland's internal waters and to territorial seas to England. This changed the existing established maritime boundary between Scotland and England in the North Sea in England's favour, and permits exploitation of historical Scottish marine resources, including fisheries and mineral rights, by UK governments for the benefit of England. It was enabled by passing the Adjacent Waters Boundaries Order 1999 as a statutory instrument of the UK government. This redefined the boundaries of internal waters, territorial sea and fishing limits adjacent to the east coast of Scotland without the consent of the Scottish people. This here shows the change. The dotted line at the bottom is where the normal boundary would be, and the blue line shows how much it was changed, and those waters were illegally taken from Scotland's Crown territorial waters. (1970s to 2025) Colonial economic plunder. Oil and gas and renewable energy, the realities of an energy-rich Scotland plundered under colonial rule. This concerns the theft exported with an insignificant fraction of the proceeds coming to Scotland of Scotland's vast oil and gas wealth, which is still ongoing, and with much of Scotland's gas production always used to support England's gas-powered electricity generation. It also concerns Scotland's vast renewable energy production, which is being plundered, exported at no cost to the importing country for use in England. In the 18th century, England's greatest resource was wool, which generated 1/3 of its foreign exports. No one could imagine Scotland, the voluntary partner, helping itself to England's great wool resource as any more credible than Scotland taking over a 20th century city of London. In contrast, Scotland, the voluntary partner, had its oil, gas and renewables removed in right of an English crown and limited revenue obscurely arrived at, delivered back to it. Scotland's claim of right does not permit our territory and resources to be plundered in this fashion, any more than the trade assurances of the Treaty of Union deemed theft an equitable trade practice. It falls on the United Kingdom to demonstrate a valid partnership agreement which might justify any of this, or accept it is justified by nothing more than the imposition of a foreign colonising sovereignty. Scotland's renewable energy production is calculated to have a retail value of at least 60 billion per annum by 2030, based on UK prices of around 30 pence per kilowatt hour. And given expected additional production, we might reasonably project this resource will have a retail value exceeding 100 billion per annum shortly, every year for at least the next 30 years and probably much longer. Scots will not see or benefit from any of this, as we would have done with a share-owned energy company and better management of our resources. In Scotland, high electricity prices are the norm, and that will not change under London rule, which in turn also limits the future social and economic prospects of Scots. Scotland's vast renewable energy capacity is, just like our oil and gas, geared mostly to serving the needs of England's far greater population. As much as 90% of this production is planned to directly supply England via cables already laid and in the process of being laid. As in the case with oil and gas, Scots will not see much, if any, financial benefit from this business. But the effects from exploitation of Scotland's resources does not end there. Whilst resources are extracted cheaply from a colony, supplies to the colonised country are priced high, which means the colonised people get hit twice: the theft of their resources and being made to have suffered higher prices for goods and services supplied back to them by the coloniser and the corporations and market regulators who control the rigged market. In order to illustrate and prove this reality, we compare colonial Scotland's domestic electricity prices with other oil and gas-rich countries which are independent. Most of these, like Scotland, also now have a strong focus on developing renewable energy capacity. The data in the table below tells us that, as part of the UK, Scotland's electricity price of 44 pence a US dollar is far higher than all of the world's major oil-producing nations. Norway's low electricity prices have enabled it to build over 100 electric ferries, and 90% of all new cars registrations there are electric. In several other oil-rich nations, electricity prices are only about 1/10 of that in Scotland, with some very close to zero. So Scotland is unique amongst the world's oil and gas producing nations, suffering from extremely high electricity prices imposed via London rule. Colonial Marker 6, Denial of Self-Determination. 2014, a false referendum on Scottish independence. A referendum was held in Scotland on the 18th of September 2014, using the referendum question, should Scotland be an independent country? 55% of voters answered no and 45% yes. The referendum used an open franchise, This included people with temporary residencies or loose ties to Scotland being allowed to vote on the constitutional future of Scotland. The result of the 2014 Westminster-designed local authority franchise-based non-binding referendum did not provide a true picture of the desire for independence among Indigenous Scots or residents with a proven long-term commitment to Scotland. This franchise is acceptable for domestic municipal affairs, but not for national constitutional matters, as these should be reserved for Indigenous Scots and those with a proven long-term commitment to Scotland and its people. The referendum was managed by the UK's devolved administration in Scotland and covered by the national UK media in Scotland, including the BBC and newspapers based outside of Scotland, who were visibly biased in favour of the no vote. Given the media bias and the breaching of the campaigning purdah period and the new initiatives bribes offered by UK politicians as inducements to vote no late in the campaign period, the 2014 referendum was clearly a performative exercise by UK authorities to mask a substantive and comprehensive denial of the democratic right of the Scots to self-determination. By simulating a democratic expression of that right, the 2014 independence referendum result was used to try to convince the international community that Scotland is indeed a voluntary partner in the Union of Nations and wishes to remain there by consent, which is not the case for the majority of Scots. 2016, Scots denied national choice in the EU referendum. In holding the referendum, the UK government did not acknowledge or respect the legitimate sovereignty of Scotland, and as a result, Scotland, under force by the UK government, left the EU in January 2020 after 47 years of membership, along with the rest of the UK, despite clearly voting to remain and against the national democratic will. The EU exit, Brexit, provides further direct and clear evidence of denial of Scotland's sovereignty and democratic agency within the so-called voluntary partnership of the United Kingdom. With less than 10% of the UK population, the views and choices made by Scots are simply overruled, systematically and without consultation, by the administering Anglo-British state, where these diverge from those of England. This is in breach of England's obligations under the Claim of Right and the comprehensively abused, discredited and never implemented Treaty of Union. Scotland, as an independent state, had enjoyed several hundred years of peaceful trading and cultural interchange with the countries of mainland Europe. This is reflected in the rich presence of European language roots in the Scots language, the Latin influence in Scots law, and religious influences. During most of this period, England was at war with much of Europe, as well as with Scotland. In other words, Scotland's cultural traditions and heritage are distinctly far more European Latin than Anglo-Saxon, and hence we find domination by the latter to be more than an aggressive form of cultural imperialism, and hence oppression, with our people and nation subject to the constant imposition of a range of colonial procedures obscured by the pretext and hoax of union. Scotland was removed from membership of the European Single Market and the Customs Union by the UK government against its democratic will, and is now suffering from very significant and adverse economic, cultural and demographic impacts from this decision. 2016, the UK referendum on membership of the European Union, 62% of the electorate in Scotland voted to remain in the EU, with a majority of votes in all Scottish regions voting in favour of continued membership. Colonial Marker 7, Shared Features of Colonialised Societies. Introduction. Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, established how colonial violence creates intergenerational psychological trauma, which manifests as persistent anxiety and depression in colonialised populations. This was expanded by Ashe Nadi's The Intimate Enemy, 1983, which shows how colonialism creates a psychological framework of self-hatred and cultural alienation that continues to affect health behaviours long after formal colonialism ends. This psychological impact combines with material deprivation, as described by Albert Memmi in 1957, where economic marginalisation and social degradation become internalised, leading to what is now recognised as historical trauma response, visible in high rates of substance abuse and mental health issues across generations. Memmi specifically identifies how the systematic denigration of native languages and cultural practice creates what he terms a psycho-existential complex, where the colonised people internalise their supposed inferiority, leading to self-alienation and profound psychological damage. Nandi deepens this analysis by exploring how colonisation operates through the intimate enemy of cultural and linguistic dominance, creates a psychological state where the colonised begin to view their own cultural practices and languages as backward and primitive. Memmi's cultural dualism has become a salient and much debated feature in Scottish literature and culture, where it is often expressed through what's known as the colonial anti-zingy, a term coined by G. Gregory Smith in 1919 to describe the dual nature of Scots identity and its literature. Post-colonial literature is only beginning to impact on the ongoing debate and, indeed, to reveal the true source of much of this discussed phenomenon. The accompanying interplay of physical health with historical trauma response, inferiorization and lack of acceptance in today's widely understood Michael Mammo status syndrome demonstrates that health outcomes follow a clear social gradient, where lower social status consistently correlates with poorer health, independent of absolute poverty. This relationship operates through multiple interconnected pathways. Reduced autonomy and control over life circumstances reinforces chronic stress. Limited social participation, weakened support networks, restricted opportunities for forced societal engagement, reduced access to health-promoting resources. These factors create a self-reinforcing cycle, a feedback loop where lower status augments biological stress responses, leading to poorer health outcomes, which in turn further diminish social participation and control, perpetuating health inequalities across generations. Colonial Marker 7, Shared Features of Colonialised Societies. 2000s, Scotland's health crisis and ongoing colonial legacy. With an average life expectancy at birth of just 77.1 years, and in the most deprived areas only 47 years, Scotland lags comparably behind European states by 6.4% or 5 years of life. All other indicators underperform England and show marked negative variances from the European nation average. Scotland suffers between 4 and 5 times the European average for drug deaths. Alcohol deaths are nearly 3 times the European average. This should be a matter of alarm not only to the UK government arm in Scotland, but to the UK government itself. Instead, it is used as a stick to beat those administering Scotland, chastising them for not achieving more with consistently less financial resources and with no direct access to Scotland's own resources. No consideration is ever given to the root cause of this malaise, the colonial landscape, or any thought of how to alleviate it. As Michael Mamott shows, it is futile to try to cure these ills by a general lifting of prosperity, even if economic conditions permitted and the administrative state were willing to do so. A comprehensive societal reset is demanded that will relieve Scottish native society much of it exposed to the health and welfare conditions described here, for an externally imposed cultural divide to replace it with the more equitable society for which they consistently vote. Sir Harry Burns, the former Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, highlighted the reputation of Scotland as being the sick man of Europe in 2009. A comparison of key health indicators between Scotland and 5 other European countries, including England, the others chosen for similarity of population, makes for a bleak picture. See the next slide for the table. Scotland has the worst outcome in all 10 of the categories examined: life expectancy, obesity, drug deaths, alcohol deaths, homicides, prison population, suicide, poor mental health, cancer mortality and smoking. Around 60% of Scotland's excess mortality stems from psychosocial causes: alcohol, drugs, violence and suicide. The remaining excess is mainly attributed to cancer, cardiovascular causes and stroke. Dental health is widely considered a valuable indicator of overall population health, as it provides a snapshot of socio-economic conditions and generational patterns and correlates with other health metrics. The persistence of Scotland's deep oral health inequalities is highlighted here. The Scottish Needs Assessment Programme on Adult Oral Health reported the level of dental health in Scotland is poorer than in England and Wales, with approximately 1 in 5 Scottish individuals over the age of 16 years having lost all their natural teeth and almost all of the remainder having some form of gum disease. This is exaggerated by the fact that only a small proportion of population is registered with a dentist. This shows Scotland's problem, caused by colonisation and economic inequalities and degradation. On the third slide, I mentioned that I'll give you a link or tell you how to get the information so that you can print this video text off for yourself and to show the references where the data came from. There are other useful links to documents which are also part of the initial UN decolonisation submission by Liberation Scotland. If you go down the different images and come to Colonial Markers Illustrated, you can find all the information in this video there and print it off or read it online as required. I hope you found this long video interesting. These are the videos I have on YouTube. If you go into YouTube and on the search bar at the top type in the names as typed here, you will find my videos. Alternatively, you can log on to my channel in YouTube at @RobertAnderson9116 and you'll see my list. This would also allow me to notify you when new videos are created. This was the plan I had at the end of 24 for videos for 25, and these are the ones I have not yet done. The next video will be free ports in Scotland, which I've actually started on, followed by too wee, too stupid, too small. Thank you for watching and listening to my videos. Thank you.